Hello, welcome to the Math Success Workshop. This is part 3 where we're going to talk about how to effectively use your mathematics textbook. Right, so just like the other videos that we've had, if you've watched the first two, starting off with a question for you to consider: do you use your math textbook? All right, and then how could you make your math textbook a useful tool? And I've had a lot of students, I've heard, when I tutor students, they'll ask me a question. I'm like, oh, this is a formula. Do you have your book with you, and we can look it up and find what we need in the book? And then a lot of times I get the response, oh, my teacher doesn't use the book. Right? Well, there's a couple things wrong with that statement. First thing, teachers do use a textbook. They might not tell you to bring a book to class. They might not sit there and read out of the textbook. Hopefully they don't just sit there and read out of the textbook during class. They might not even mention the textbook during class at all. Right? They might not give you homework out of a book. But pretty much all math classes are based on some textbook. Teachers are not just making the stuff up on the fly. They don't just walk into class and say, all right, let's talk about math today. Like, it's based on something that's in a book somewhere that they're using as the basis of the class, right? So teachers are using textbooks, even if they are not making that known to you or making a big deal about it. The class is based on some book somewhere. And then second, even if your teacher doesn't use a textbook, that doesn't mean that you can't use the textbook for the class, right? Students say, well, the homework's online, it's not out of the textbook, and my teacher gives me notes, so I don't even know if I need the textbook for this class, right? Just because the teacher doesn't use it doesn't mean that the students can't use it. Textbooks do have a lot of useful resources that can be helpful for students in class. Now, that being said, math textbooks are notoriously difficult to read. Sometimes they don't make a whole lot of sense, unless you already kind of have a good idea about what it is that it's talking about. Which for a lot of students, that doesn't help, because the reason you're a student in the class is because you don't have a really good idea about this stuff. That's why you're learning it. So math textbooks can be difficult to use, but in this video here, I'm going to talk about things you can do with the textbook that hopefully will be helpful for you. All right, so things you can do to use the textbook. One thing, and if you watched the last video that I did about taking notes, this is something I mentioned in that video. You can read upcoming sections before class, right? So if I know tomorrow I'm doing section 4.2, that's what my teacher is going to be talking about. Well, the night before, I can just go through and read 4.2 on my own. Right now, like I just said, math textbooks are sometimes difficult to read. It's sometimes hard to understand what they're saying. But if you're kind of previewing the section before class, when you read through it, you don't have to completely understand everything you read. You're just getting some idea of how what topics are covered in this section, how it's mapped out, how the ideas flow. It's this definition, and then it's this definition, and then that's this formula, and then there's these example problems. So, just getting that idea about what's coming up kind of fertilizes your mind a little bit, makes you a little bit more receptive to those ideas when your teacher talks about them in class. And also, like I mentioned in that last video, makes it a little bit easier as far as knowing what's important when you're trying to take notes in class. Right, so reading those upcoming sections, it's a good thing you can do with a textbook, before class starts. Right, like I said, even if you don't understand everything that it says, that's okay. That's what your teacher's for, is to help you understand those things that your textbook says. Right, so preview it yourself, and then when you listen to the teacher talk about it, hopefully it'll start making a lot more sense than when you read it yourself. You can also read along during class. Right, so you can take your textbook out, put it on your desk during class, and as your teacher's going through and giving examples and doing definitions and stuff like that, you can listen to what the teacher says and also read what the book says, because they don't always explain things the same way. Right, your book, whoever wrote your textbook might have one way to explain something, and your teacher might have a different take on it and explain it in a different way. Right, and sometimes getting two different perspectives helps it to make more sense to you. Right? Maybe what your teacher's saying doesn't quite make sense, or it's not clicking with you as far as how it all works, but then if you read it in the book and it's explained slightly differently, that makes more sense. Right? So reading along during class, another thing you can do with your textbook that might be helpful. You can use your textbook to clarify confusing topics. Again, in that last video that I did about the notes, after class, if you wrote something down in your notes that didn't quite make sense to you during class, hopefully you mark that in your notes, and then after class you can go back to it and try to figure out what it was all about, right? And one of the tools you can use to clarify that information is the textbook, right? The back of every textbook has an index where it just lists every topic that's in that book and tells you what page it's on. So you can just go to the index and look for the topic that was giving you trouble, figure out what page it's on, and then just go look at the stuff in the textbook, right? It might be, like I said, a different explanation than what your teacher gave. Maybe they have slightly different examples than the ones your teacher did in class, and seeing those extra examples or seeing those different explanations might help clarify those confusing topics. All right, so again, the textbook is one tool you can use to help you clarify things that you thought were confusing. You can read through the example problems in the textbook, again, to clarify things that you from your notes of what happened in class. You can read through the example problems. If you're having trouble trying to do a homework problem, there might be an example in the book that's similar to that homework problem, and if you read through that example and the explanation of how to do it, it might help you be able to figure out how to do that homework problem. Something else the book is useful for is extra practice problems, right? Textbooks have a whole bunch of problems at the end of each section. And most teachers do not ask you to do all of those problems because it's just too many for most students to do. It's not always necessary to do that many, right? Usually you do 5, 6, maybe 10 problems on a certain topic, and that's enough for you to understand it. Well, that's enough for some people to understand it, but maybe you don't understand it. Maybe you've done those problems and you're like, well, this is still kind of confusing for me, or, I still kind of get stuck in the middle here where I start working on the problem and then I get lost and I forget what to do. Well, guess what? There's more than just those 5 to 10 problems in the book. Right? Open up your book and just pick other problems that your teacher didn't ask you to do. You can still do those other problems. More practice is always better, right? Especially when you're doing math, right? You learn math by actually doing math problems. So the more problems you do, the better you're going to learn it, right? And most math textbooks have the answers to the odd number problems, at least, in the back of the book. So as you're working on those problems, you can flip to the back of the book and just double check to make sure that you're doing them correctly or that you're getting the correct answer. And if you're not, well, then you can maybe go ask somebody for help, whether it's your teacher or a tutor or something like that, and get some help with the stuff that you're not understanding, right? But textbooks are an excellent source of extra practice problems. By the way, also good when you're preparing for a test. If your teacher doesn't give you a test review or like problems to do to help you get ready for a test, your textbook has a whole bunch of them. So you can always open up the book and find some problems to do that can help you practice to help you study and get ready for a test. We also have alternative sources of information, right, besides just the textbook. So if you're trying to see more example problems or look for more problems to do to practice, or you're looking to clarify topics in class, they got this thing called the internet that has all types of stuff on there. Pretty much anything you could want to find, you can find on the internet. A couple of good sources are YouTube and also Khan Academy. Those are ones most people have probably heard of before. There are other sources as well on the internet. There's websites that are just devoted to math, where they explain all kinds of topics in math, from basic elementary school math right up through calculus and college math courses. If the textbook, for these things we mentioned above, clarifying topics, looking for example problems, extra practice problems. If the textbook isn't enough there, or if the textbook is just too confusing, as some textbooks are, you can use the internet as another source, an alternative source of information to help you do those same things. All right. The key thing is, after you take your notes in class, going back and reviewing them to make sure that the things that you covered in class make sense to you, before next class comes up. Right. If they don't, you get some clarifying information from your textbook or online somewhere. You do some example problems, you do some practice problems. All those things are important as you're going along. The thing about math classes is, if you're having trouble with something, you can't wait a few weeks or a month to go get help, because the things you do next week are based on the things you're doing this week. So if you don't understand what happened this week, by next week you're probably going to be totally lost. All right, so as soon as there's any sign of trouble, right, something that you're not sure about, you need to go get help with that right away, right? And again, the textbook or online resources are one source of information you can use, or a couple sources of information you can use to get that help that you need. All right, so that's it about using the textbook for your math class. In the next video that we do, we'll be talking about doing your homework and some tips for doing math homework. All right, so make sure you check out that next video for some homework tips.